There is some interesting questions about whether or not the Norse relied in the same way that the English did on the shield wall. Um, I don't know if they did or didn't. I don't know as much about Norse war practices because they didn't write stuff down as much because they weren't as cool. Let's be honest. Relationship between a leader and his warband was so important. It was used to aid the conversion of the Saxons and the English to Christianity. This is that poem I was talking about at the beginning of the class, the Heiland. And it became known to the land folk, to each his bastion, that the Son of God was gathering followers, and he himself spoke so many a wise word, and such words of truth that shining wonders he did show them tokens, did work show him and tokens did work in this world. So in this case, when they use the translation is was gathering followers. The original Saxon word, Old Saxon word here is Yesithos. So it's that same band of followers as you would have in a war band, and that just amuses the ever loving heck. It's legitimately a very good read. Um, Orning suggests that the time spent at feast, he cites festivities that lasted up to 8 days, creating a powerful connection between participants. So basically, you didn't just attend a feast for one day, you attended for 8 days, which sounds exhausting. Okay. Cool. So that brings us kind of to the end of that section. And the last section we're going to talk about is etiquette. We've got 15 minutes left in this 2-hour time block. I can't believe we've been going for 2 hours. That's a lot. So we're going to kind of burn through etiquette. I do really encourage you, if you're not already looking at the handout, the handout's got some specific sites from sagas and poetry and other sources that are talking about this. But I'm not out of water. So etiquette. Take the seat you're assigned by the master of the hall, assuming it's appropriate. So you're not going to stand up there and keep arguing with him until you might get a better seat. Assuming that it's not, you haven't been insulted too much, you're just going to take your seat. When you show up to the feast, you should be clean. There's a number of examples of hand washing at the feast. So if I remember correctly, in Beowulf, one of the women goes around and brings water to wash the men's hands. Bergthora is another example in Burnt Njal's saga, where she brings water to wash hands, water and towels, and welcoming speech, should he find who comes to the feast. That's from the Havamal. It says here, hand washing not addressed in Beowulf. So that was a misremembered citation. I apologize. This is one of those moments from 13th Warrior, which always amuses me. So in the the actual Ibn Fadhalan's memories and writings about his time with the Rus, he is completely disgusted by their washing practices and their grooming practices, and is just like, these people with one water bowl. It's disgusting. But it's important to remember that he's coming from a society where there's a very strong value placed on personal cleanliness, and it has connections to spiritual purity. So they're cleaner, more maybe than other people, but maybe not as clean as he would like. There's also a treaty negotiated in 907 between the Byzantine Empire and the Rus that contained most of the usual provisions you might expect. That they were obliged to give them food and drink and supplies for their ships. However, it also included a provision that they were required to provide baths for the Rus as often as they want them. So these people, I don't know how often they were bathing, but they were clearly bathing enough. Or maybe not enough for Ibn Fadhalan, but enough for the time? I don't know. So be clean, be sociable. Participate in the feast. So it was considered there's a whole saga, Viga Glum saga, which is all about Glum Viga and his inability to be an upbeat and happy person. So you should show up to the meal. You should talk to your neighbors, the people you're seated with, participate in the feast. You don't want to gorge yourself because that's rude, but you should show up. You should have fun, be pleasant to be around. Keep your social behavior appropriate. So don't embarrass people with questions. Don't be too braggadocious. Give them an opportunity, give everybody an opportunity to proclaim their own accomplishments. Maybe talk up your friends, but don't talk them up to a point where they're now embarrassed by the fact that maybe they don't meet your vision of how cool they are. Also, don't tease each other too much that it leads to violence. You should avoid being too violent at the feast. The Havamal does suggest that you should keep your mouth shut. But the sagas seem to give an alternative option, and that is that you should be chatty and talk at these events. So that's something to keep in mind. So maybe keep your mouth shut when you're among strangers, but when you're among friends, be a social human being. Keep your drinking under control. So you're expected to drink quite a lot, and typically men did kind of get to a point where they were pretty drunk, but or at least that's what the sagas suggest. But you should not get to the point where you're sloppy. It's interesting to me that, especially in the Icelandic sagas, Icelanders see mainlanders as incredibly boozy, that they're always overly drunk, they're wasting people's times, all this kind of stuff. And when they go abroad, the Norwegians see the Icelandic people as very messy drunks. So, again, unreliable narrators. Inebriation, especially among women, was not a good sign. Women were not supposed to, especially high-status women, were not supposed to get drunk in public. Charlemagne couldn't stand drunkards and would kick them out of his palace. So don't get drunk at Charlemagne's court. We talked about gift giving already. Return your gifts. Any gift you receive with other gifts. Don't touch the unmarried women unless you have plans to make them married, or not be an asshole. But basically, touching especially unmarried women, was sort of a sexual come on. So don't do that. That's rude. Don't interrupt a performer. So there's one modern scholar, Price, who argues that the Volpsa, which is a part of the Poetic Edda, says basically the vulva is making her prophecies, and Odin goes to interrupt her, and she's like, no, it's my time now. So nobody, not even Odin, should interrupt the performers. Generally, Skald and Skalps were allowed to perform unharried in sagas, but they're the people theoretically writing them. Also, if somebody does get obnoxious in the hall, don't rise to the bait and bring violence. This was a time of enjoyment and happiness, presumably, and communal celebration, and you shouldn't show up and be that guy. So basically, don't be that guy. And that seems to be, at least to what I have found, seems to be the main rules that kind of govern how you should behave at these events. I summarized those on, I think, page 39. So you can, if you don't want to read all this writing that I put so much time into, if you don't want to, there's a summary, page 39. We didn't really talk about the Sumbul. We know a bit about it. We don't know a lot about it. It was written about after the conversion of Christianity. It's a specifically a religious activity. So I've discussed it very little, just because there's not a lot of good information available, or reliable. There's a lot of information, not a whole lot of reliable information. The role of women. This is one of the things that I felt very drawn to initially when I began researching this, was the image of the Lady of the Mead Hall, the lady with the mead cup, which shows up a lot in Germanic art and mythology, as well as Celtic art to a lesser extent. And in Beowulf, you have Wealhtheow comes in bearing the mead cup. There's the Oseberg finds. Among the Oseberg finds, there's a very beautiful bucket with a ladle and some small containers that were presumably used to serve alcohol or some beverage. Behind me somewhere, I have buried. I have a reconstruction of, I think, the Oseberg ladle that I'm hopefully going to get to use this November. But it's an image that I find very striking, and a big question about whether or not this was something that really persisted in any of the Germanic cultures. Maxims, which is a less mythic poem than Beowulf is. Maxims is another Old Norse or Old English poem, and it discusses that, like, what makes a good queen, and one of those things that she should be light in her mood and give good gifts and fill his hand first with the cup, reaching quickly. And so there's some argument there that what that's indicating is that that at least in England it did persist, this notion of the woman with the mead cup. There's less good examples of it in Norse sources. Lokasenna, which is when Loki, in the Poetic Edda, when Loki insults everybody, Sif acts in this role, and she shows up with the beverage and feeds him and provides him with mead. And then there's some sagas where at least women are shown serving alcohol, not necessarily in that initial ritual role, but they are sort of the one who's distributing the drink. There's also the motif of the sober queen, which shows up quite a lot in Norse mythology. The sober queen is this idea that she should be of sober mind, not just like sober in terms of not drinking alcohol, but that she should have a sober mind and be calm and this very like rational person in sort of the chaos of the feast hall. Lots of examples of women who are renowned for their wisdom and surety of mind. Judith is a good example. Odd, the deep-minded, in Laxdala saga is another good example. There's a saga of the Volsungs where Hjordis and her bondwoman decide to trade clothes to trick somebody, and the bondwoman is immediately found out because she admits to drinking quite a lot of alcohol in her youth, which is something that no noble lady would have done. And then women are also connected with the production of alcohol. So there's examples where the King Auric, so on account of their squabbles, King Auric couldn't keep both wives. So he said he'd keep the one that made the best ale when he came home from summer raiding. And they competed at the brewing, and they, make various prayers and offerings and so forth. He spat on the yeast and said he'd be back for what was between the tub and her. And that proved good ale, is the translation. So anyway, and the modern surname Brewster. If you know any Brewsters, Brewster means a female brewer. So again, we could talk about fertility, but I'm not going to. So that clocking in at about an hour and a half is my class. So I guess I could have slowed down there in the middle, but yeah. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions, my email address is at the top of the handout. You can also comment on the handout if you've got specific, like you want to point to a specific section where you've got questions. There's a bunch of sources. For each of the sagas and poems and so forth, I've provided where it's from, where it took place, or when the events took place, when we think the authorship was, what kind of saga or what kind of document it is, and whether or not I think it's worthless drivel. And I'll be honest, the only person who gets a resounding yes is Saxo Grammaticus. Spit. And then there's like standard sources. So anyway, thank you guys very much for coming to my class. It was, only an hour and a half long, and I hope you're well, and I will see you when I see you. And now I have to figure out how to turn this off.